Okay, Ira, I heard that no one had ever blessed you with an advanced role-playing game event. So I've gathered only you here today.
Oh, thank you.
Because I thought, we have a lot of stuff to take care of. It's Sunday. And so I thought we'd make it fun.
Okay.
We'll make it kind of like a game.
Yeah.
So first of all, before we get started, I have 3 pre-made character sheets for you to pick from.
All right, let me see them.
Yeah, you could be a barbarian.
Okay, I like that.
You can be a bard. Or you can be a rogue. And think really effectively, like about what would help you get all of your Sunday chores done.
Okay, like Rogue from the X-Men?
No, not as cool as that. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
More of like a thief type character,
Gotcha.
Sneaky, like, oh, I gotta get my laundry done. I'm gonna like roll into the laundry room and I'm gonna quietly fold the laundry.
Ooh, I like that. Do I get a hood? Am I wearing a hood?
Yes.
All right, I'm gonna go with a rogue.
Rogue, okay. Perfect. All right. So what's the first thing on our list?
Ooh, I love a good list.
Yeah, I mean, otherwise, like, we're not going to get any of this stuff done.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first thing we got to do, and this is great because you're a rogue. So think of it like a heist. What we have to do is we have to go to the grocery store.
Okay.
And we have to carefully go up and down each aisle, getting only the items that we need to eat and take care of other household stuff, like cleaning supplies. Without walking out of the store without paying.
Oh.
So, are you ready?
Yes.
Okay, go.
Okay, I'm going to start in produce, and I'm going to grab myself some carrots and slip them under my cloak.
Okay, make a sleight of hand roll.
Okay. 8.
You are immediately assaulted by 2 giant grocery store workers who have seen you shoplifting and are emboldened by your erroneous ways. They are going to try to arrest you to jail. What do you do?
Okay, can I fashion a weapon out of the carrots?
No.
Okay.
You have one. You have a little dagger under your cloak.
Okay. Do I have my phone? Can I call a friend? Is this that type of game? I'm not really familiar with this format.
Yeah, if they take you to jail, you do get 1 phone call.
Okay.
So you find yourself in prison with your 1 phone call. You have failed the quest.
Wow, that was a lot. That wasn't quite what I expected from my first epic adventure RPG.
Yeah, you would be surprised. This is realistic D&D, where the vast majority of people take big risks and fail horribly.
Yeah, it's extremely grounded. I like that, though.
Yeah, you should consider yourself lucky that your character didn't lose an arm or a leg.
Well, maybe we can try again next week, but for now, I suppose we should just introduce ourselves.
Yeah, hi, I'm here to pay his bail. My name is Caitlin Cadieux. My credential, I'm an animator and illustrator. And
I know what you're thinking, not Rogue from the X-Men. I'm actually Ira Marcks. I write and draw comics, and I'm very grateful Caitlin is here today to help me out of this situation that she also put me in, so I'm quite confused.
I'll do it again.
And welcome to our podcast about cartoons, where 2 lifelong artists and fans talk about the mysterious and magical process of bringing cartoon stories to life.
In today's episode, we're going on one last big epic quest to find the Phoenix Gem at the heart of Pixar's fantasy 80s teen road trip film, Onward. Welcome to Cartoon Feelings.
Caitlin, I'd like to congratulate you on choosing this movie when you did. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Does that sound sarcastic? I really am.
Yes, though. Yes, it does.
Well, then I'll explain why. So we've
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. So we just did a run of some real high bar fantasy from the 80s. And this week we're doing Onward, which I hadn't really thought as much about this when we first saw this movie together back in 2020, so long ago. Before
time was time.
But this movie is taking 1980s fantasy tropes in a it's taking them and stirring them into a pot in a very different way than some of the movies that we've been looking at have. And I just think it puts a nice little bow on the last month or so of conversation.
You're 100% correct. And also, I guess I just want to say, although this probably only matters to us and in a very not significant way, but as you say, as you claimed in our very first episode of Cartoon Feelings, this film, us seeing this movie together was like the inception of your whole idea of us doing this podcast. So
yeah,
it's like we're coming full circle in a way. Show's not over though. Like we're going to keep going.
Yeah, it's more of a spiral we're doing.
Yeah.
We've looped back, but we're kind of ascending.
Onward, if you will.
Tower of Babel style. Yeah. Till it all comes crashing down.
So thrilling. It's just a nice little, I don't know, put a little ribbon on there.
Yeah. So this movie, I like this movie, and we'll get into what I like about it, but I partly like it because we saw it together and now we have a podcast. The end.
It's a friendship movie. The content of the movie is meaningless.
Right. It's more just about being in the theater that day and that time.
An experience that may never happen again. I really hope it happens again. Please, please.
No, don't. You're just veering the van off onto the trail of peril with a statement like that. So
I'm trying to cast this magic spell of COVID over. Theater's open. So we'll check on that at the end of the show.
Yeah, we'll check back in with the news.
It's brewing now.
All right. Well, while we're waiting for that page to refresh, let's do a little escapism. So I think we got to talk D&D a little bit here, actually, because that's kind of that's in the flavor of this film, even though it's rarely directly addressed. Like there's kind of one scene where they bring up an actual role-playing style game, which I believe is called, what is it? The Quest of Yore, I think.
Something like that. It has yore in it for sure. Full of yore.
And I personally would have liked a little more of that game. And I think it's actually a game you can buy now. So
really?
Yeah. Whether it's out yet or not, I'm not sure, but they were working on it. So anyway, we're going to have our own little role-playing D&D conversation for a second. And it's going to start with just a very simple question. So, Caitlin, what fantasy trope character are you? And I know you actually play D&D, so it could, let's say it's not that, whatever that character is, because I actually don't know.
Well, I've played many characters in my time.
Oh, okay.
Ira in the fantasy worlds that I inhabit. I guess now can be a good time where I plug my other podcast that we're starting again. That's like
sure,
where we play D&D, but it's creative people. It's called Creatures and Creatives. Look it up. We had a first season, and then it was kind of like a lost tape situation where a lot of our audio was murdered, so it didn't actually resolve. But we are embarking on a second season now. Check it out. Anyway.
Well, I'm excited. I'm excited to hear it. So listen along with me.
Yeah, it should be pretty good. It should be very fantastical, magical. My character is a ghost in this one, so I'm pretty excited about figuring out how that works. It's actually not D&D either. We're playing a different system called Quest. Anyway, not Quest of Yore. Different thing.
Different quest.
There's so many to choose from in this day and age. But I take it that the question that you're asking me now is like, Caitlin Cadieux, if you were a D&D creation, what would you be? Like, what's my class?
Yeah, kind of. It's more of a what's your sign type of question. Like, what's your sort of like astrological alignment in the fantasy world? I'm
so glad you asked me that, because I was planning on bringing that up later, because there are centaurs in this movie and I am naturally a Sagittarius. So you can tell that I have a lot of fantastical energies already. It's in the stars.
I have a lot of nautical energy because I'm a Cancer, so I'm a crab.
Oh, I do like the crab. So this is great. We're all fantasy creatures already.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a theory about role-playing games. This is kind of a a little anecdote that it will resolve with an answer to your question.
All right.
My theory is that the first time you ever play a role-playing game, you tend to create a character that is you, which, I don't know, the more you play and the more you like create new characters, you get like, more and more invested in like the creative process and like the enjoyment of what that is and like how am I going to role play them and like what cool stuff can I do. But the first time you don't really know what the system, like how the game works. So you're kind of defaulting to things that just jump out at you right away. And then that ends up being kind of more similar to you as a person, I think.
Yeah.
And my first character, her name was Poppy Pinescrub, and she was a wood elf druid. And I named her Poppy Pinescrub because I Googled a D&D character name generator, and it came up with Caitlin Pinescrub, which I think was absolutely hysterical. So I was like, well, I have to use Pinescrub, but I'll change the name because I don't want it to just be Caitlin. But I loved the druid class because you can shapeshift into animals, and there's a whole like system that deals with that. And it's very like nature magic, and that really appealed to me. So I've played a bunch of other characters that are totally different or like all across the spectrum, but that's the one I think back and I'm like, yes, like this was what I just like casually saw in the D&D rulebook and was like, awesome. I'm gonna love being a wolf or whatever and like ripping off the barbarian enemy's arms. And I did. And it was great.
So you didn't play in high school or anything, right? Is D&D kind of a new element of your social life?
Yes.
Okay.
For a few years at this point, but as has come up frequently on this podcast before, like my dad is very nerdy and very into tabletop game stuff, and a lot of the stuff that I like, you know, is probably from him in a lot of ways. And we spent a lot of time in game stores, like playing games together, and I would hear people playing D&D, you know, people at the next table would be playing in a big group, and I was always like, that looks really fun, like I want to do that, but we just never did for some reason. And it's funny because now my dad also plays D&D, but like we just never thought to actually try it, I guess. And then in the past few years, many a podcast has come out, and it's just sort of revitalized itself in pop culture.
Yeah.
And it actually was like my DM on Creatures and Creatives, Evan Abrams, who is fantastic. He and I met at a work thing. I was in San Francisco to do some Adobe videos for Behance. And he was the host of that. So I'd never met him before. And we were just chatting like on off days, and D&D came up. And he was like, we should try it. And we went to a game store in San Francisco, and we just like did a drop-in night with like 10 strangers who were already playing. And so we mostly just like observed, honestly, like didn't do a lot of dice rolling, but it was really fun. And he had played before, and he was like DMs a lot. So that was really cool. And that was my first exposure to it. And then he actually lives in Ottawa, so we're not local to each other, but we just played online ever since.
Beautiful.
I am curious now, though, what your experiences have been, and also what your sign is.
Well, I don't know if this is reflective of my personality, but nobody's ever invited me to do any role playing ever in my life. And I don't know
A
if
moment
I
of silence. A moment of silence.
I'm not saying it as like, oh, woe is me, but I just wonder if I don't present myself as like a team player or like someone that adds something fun in a situation like that. So I suppose my fantasy character is, I'm like Strider, but never became Aragorn. I'm like just kind of the crummy guy in the corner who no one really wants to talk to.
When conflict really popped off, like at the end when Elrond came and was like, we fixed your sword, like here's your sword, go do it. You were like, no, I really don't want to. Please
like,
leave me alone.
Probably just stay over here. I mean,
I'm not doing it.
I'm half joking because I thought it was just fun to tell like the opposite version of your story. But I mean, I've always been very fascinated with Dungeons and Dragons style stuff. And the closest I came to doing anything like this was in high school. We played the Star Wars role-playing game, and I was just the DM or whatever you call it in Star Wars. But this is probably another reflection of my personality. I worked really hard on the first day of the campaign where I made like this audio tape I copied a bunch of sound effects from the Star Wars movies because I didn't have internet access at this point. So I was like, I need a TIE fighter sound. I guess I'll just have to go to Empire Strikes Back and tape it off the TV. And I had this whole like array of Foley art and whatnot. And I burned myself out. I'm like, this is kind of fun, but this is a lot of work.
Okay, can I just say though, I'm like really mad that nobody's asked you to play. And this is exactly how it starts. You do that, you get really turnt on it, and then you burn out.
Yeah.
And then later, maybe you get back into it. But that's like a rite of passage. You're natural.
Being the kid who's like kicking the dirt over on the sidelines, like waiting for somebody to ask. I mean, I probably would play, but I think just there's something about my brain I feel like in terms of this sort of thing, I'm already at maximum capacity in a lot of ways. And I don't know if I could make a routine out of it. You know, I could do like a day or something.
It's quite difficult, I will say.
Yeah, I would think so.
And honestly, I think that's probably a big reason why, like, nobody asked me for a long time, really, until that very specific scenario came up where I met somebody who was very into it. And I was like, we just got in a whole conversation about it. And then that kind of blossomed into this larger thing. But yeah, like went for like 20 plus years with not playing it whatsoever. And it's hard. There are a lot of cool formats nowadays. Like one of my friends plays their D&D duets where it's just her and her fiance. And they just play together where like one of them is DMing and the other person is playing this solo story, which is not something that you usually think of when you think of D&D. But it's actually really cool because there are so many flexible ways to do it. But the worst part is you still need to have at least two people be able to get together on a regular basis consistently for a big chunk of time. I mean, it's generally hours and it can be really fun, but it's tough. And even with our podcast, whether we're like planning to record something for it, or even if we're planning to just get together for fun, there's still always like a 50% chance week to week that one of us has something come up or is too busy or like too exhausted. Yeah. And it's very difficult. So I don't know, even people who do them like one weekend a month, like one day a month, struggle to actually pull it off. Which is just, I guess that's like, it's such a nice little social group thing and it can make such a big difference for people, but it's still like, it has all the same inherent problems. Yeah,
there's there's two sides of D&D that I find very beautiful and interesting for different reasons. One is what it brings out of a group of people, like the joy and the creativity, which are just, and camaraderie, which is just something that creates that formula, I think is just extra special. And there's nothing that really does it quite like D&D as an idea. And of course that I encompass all other like fantasy RPGs in that category because they're all sort of, mechanics wise, they can be very different, but I just mean they all create that type of situation. And the other side of it that I really love, which is where I've probably spent more time, is just the history of D&D. And the weird outsiderness of it all. And I feel like that once we get into the movie here, part of the reason I really like it is it has this aura of a love for role-playing games in the way that some of the other fantasy movies we've talked about are about like literary competency, like the way Gandalf has to read a book to understand the story that is about to unfold. Like we save the day by knowing how to play the game. In like a Tolkien type of story. And that's very true for this movie as well. And D&D just celebrates like people that are willing to read and go like really deep on ideas. And I think that's a really cool aspect of it. And just when it came about in the 70s, it's just a weird moment of like there's some theory about it being relevant to the gas crisis of the late 70s and people were staying home more. And so this game just sort of emerged in the way like during the pandemic, people stay in more and new social elements come out of like just our connection through our computers. It's like at that time, it was like through the mail and people just sitting and obsessing over the monster manual. So there's just like this interesting correlation that always makes like what D&D is at its core relevant again. And it's just interesting that Pixar chose to do a fantasy style D&D movie at this point. I don't know if they're playing off, I don't know, like Stranger Things doing it or what, or it just happened to align, but it's just cool that this stuff is just back in the conversation in such a huge way.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of strange, like how people play D&D. I feel like it's also really different, having not been there for the original days. Obviously, I wasn't born in the 80s and I wasn't, playing anything in the 80s. But you mentioned earlier that it really rewards people who are reading and like willing to crack something open and really get in deep with it, which is totally true. But also a lot of people play it very fast and loose, which is the way that I'm used to playing it. And I find it's a lot more how younger people play it in general. And like a lot of my intro to D&D before I actually started playing was D&D podcasts like the Adventure Zone, where the rules are completely not anything. Like it's just a framework that people are using to improv fun or weird stories. And so there will be some dice rolling and they're pulling from the rules, but a lot of it gets thrown in the garbage, probably for the best. But it's just interesting that like what D&D even is has changed a lot, it seems like, from what it was back in the day. Mm-hmm. And then what that means, because like my favorite podcast now, which is Rude Tales of Magic, which is excellent, and you should watch it, NSFW. But it's really funny. But it's also a D&D podcast, but it's like incredibly improv heavy. And again, like a lot of those rules are not anything. Like the DM famously proclaims frequently that he doesn't know any of the rules of D&D, and I think that is 100% true. But it's still great. But it's interesting because that's what D&D is to a lot of people. And that seems like the aspect of it, or the form of it, that's very popular today. So I don't know that I have a greater thought about that particular phenomenon in terms of this movie, but it's certainly something I was thinking about, like, who suggested this, kind of. And it definitely feels like it's more from that classic era of D&D, like a little bit more of the Stranger Things version of D&D.
Yeah, that kind of just the iconography at the very least, like the look of the book covers from that early like 80s era, and some of the art and like some of the monsters are just, like the Beholder, like these things are just iconic fantasy tropes at this point that they almost seem timeless, even though some of them are just weird drawings made by teenagers. That's
where all art is made.
It is true. And I mean, I think that's the other aspect. And this is like a teen Pixar movie, I think, which makes it kind of unique in some ways. And we can go there. But let's hop in to the backstory of this movie a little bit. So like we were saying, the feeling of D&D is just basically comes down to like the communal aspect, like bringing people together with like a common language or like a singular goal, at least for like the evening. And the director, Dan Scanlon, nope. So Dan Scanlon's backstory with this, the seed of an idea here is that he grew up without a dad. He lost his father when he was 3 years old. And as a teenager, he came across a home movie of his dad speaking. Sound familiar to the plot? And this was his first time hearing his dad talk. And apparently this tape was just like a single, like just small soundbite, but it became like this very precious artifact of his father because it was just like his actual voice. And so, that really resonated with him. And I guess when the opportunity came up to pitch a story to Pixar, this is the idea that came out. So as far as I can tell, of course, like, take this all with a grain of salt, because Caitlin and I are always trying to patch these stories together as best we can. And our goal is simply to be interesting and inspiring, whether we're fully truthful or not.
And correct.
Yeah, we're being as correct. I'm being as correct as possible, but I want to be inspiring.
Yeah, we're just trying our best.
Yeah. So Mr. Scanlon, or Dan, if you will, takes this idea and he wants to tell a story about growing up without a dad and having just this special little piece of him and what that can mean to a kid as a coming of age story. And I think from there, they graft on the fantasy story, partly because Dan and his older brother grew up in the early 80s. So Dungeons and Dragons was surely part of their life in some way, whether they were watching like the cartoon on TV or they were actually playing it.
Well, let me say this really quickly while you're saying that. But I was reading some reviews of this movie because I didn't when it came out. It just sort of, I don't know, COVID happened, I guess, and it just like fell to the back of my mind. So I don't know where the D&D aspect came from. I don't know who suggested it, but Dan talks in a few interviews about how he doesn't know anything about D&D. And so it was kind of difficult to incorporate it into this movie, and that he relied on people in the staff who did know about D&D to help integrate it. So I thought that was interesting because it feels like that it was not a choice that he would have made if left to his own devices.
Agreed. I think there's a weird, I don't think this movie quite comes together as much as it kind of looks like it does on the surface. So I'm glad you brought that up, and I'm glad you discovered that, because I think that would have remained a mystery to me, because it totally makes sense.
Yeah, like didn't know that until I read those quotes, but it is interesting because it totally makes sense when you consider the movie and how the D&D-esque stuff manifests. It's just like not quite fully woven into the plot.
Right. It doesn't seem like it was. That's why I was like speculating like this must have been part of his life, because otherwise why bring this element in? Other than you could kind of imagine that if you were sitting with a group of people and you were trying to create a visual metaphor for a father who was never really present, your first default is to like make it a magical world, because that's the only way you can do something. And they settle on a half dad, just a pair of pants and feet, which is a strange choice, even though it's like evoking certain like 80s comedies. But it's a weird thing that it makes sense that it might have been solved amidst a group instead of, written down by the director at an early stage.
Right.
Okay. So I thought it'd be interesting to get into a bit of the creative process behind the making of this movie, partly because it features an old friend of ours from our Burrow episode, Madeline Sharifian, who was the director. Yeah, a director that we both admire and cannot wait to see what she does next, because we both had a great time with Burrow.
Yeah, one of my favorite episodes. I don't have favorites, but that was one of my favorite episodes.
We love them all equally.
Our children.
So this is some information that comes from an article Caitlin and I were looking at from Slash Film, where one of their writers went to the set of Onward and talked with Madeline and Kelsey Mann, who was the head of story, about their process of, fleshing this movie out up to the production stage. So basic conceptual building here. So I guess they started with what's called carding, which is basically where you take a whole bunch of note cards, write down some general ideas of scenes, and throw them up on a giant bulletin board. This isn't exactly how I work, though I suppose it works really well for a group of people to generate an idea from. And at this point, I'm actually not really sure how much of a script they have that they're working from. I believe this is like a great way to rationalize certain decisions and try to create a general structure for like an hour and a half movie by just brainstorming scenes on like quick little note cards and getting like kind of in a cohesive narrative going.
I haven't really done this myself, but since I've spent so much time working in editorial, like a lot of my coworkers at The Atlantic who were documentary producers, this is the exact process they used a lot of the time as they were trying to figure out the shape of their story. And so it's obviously different. Documentary is not something that you're just like manifesting. You go out into the world and you shoot these things and you interview people and you assemble that into something that is compelling and that has this linear narrative to it. But it was interesting because even like after the fact, maybe they have a subject They go out and interview people. They go out and shoot in these various locations, and they would come back to the office and have those beats or characters, like people that they've interviewed, specific things they want to include, and they would write those out on note cards and pin them up on the wall. And then like categorize them too. So there would be columns. So, you know, this particular thing is like kind of the act one of my story. And then that would kind of help you decide, you know, this interview was cool, but it doesn't actually add anything to my thing. And it's just like a little bit easier to get all of that out before you actually sit down on a timeline in Premiere or whatever and start like chopping up footage and like playing with all the audio and stuff. It's just like paring it down to its essence. Mm-hmm. And I have to imagine for animation, I guess I've always sort of been under the impression that they don't really have a script until the last possible second. That's probably not strictly true, but ever since like the Walt Disney days, there's a lot of like storyboarding and like scenes that don't make it in, like, you know, scenes that are half animated and they don't finish that and whatever. So it always feels like they're really chaotic in a way up until the last second.
Yeah.
But
I think part of that is the tech changes so fast, and therefore, depending on what you can do, I think it could change the value of a scene. Because like for me as a comic artist, the tools and the output is generally the same. I mean, the main things that could change are it's in black and white or it's in color. But aside from that, it's not like there's a new augmented reality comic that I'm like working on and therefore like, oh, now I can finally do that cool 3D scene that I was always hoping for. So I think part of it is that, and that's probably why it wouldn't make a lot of sense to really like lock in a script early on, because I think you're mostly debating what is going to look great on screen as like a visual story. And then later you kind of patch that into a script that, you know, the director can assess and like have more input on, because I don't know if the director is always necessarily in there through all these like, you know, carding conversations.
I might be wrong about this, but I'm going to say it anyway. You can Google it later for me. But I think Disney, like Walt Disney himself, pioneered sort of the ubiquity of storyboarding for film process. And like not even just in animation, but then like live action movies started using storyboarding to figure out what they wanted to do. And it's just basically exactly what you're saying about it being maybe easier or a smarter way.
Yeah.
If you're making, you know, a visual thing, to be focusing on that first. I don't know. The story is clearly not secondary, so that's not what I'm getting at. But
well, it could be as simple as like, let's say I pitch you the idea like the woman enters the office. It's a rainy afternoon. Like I could describe that and you and I could have totally different visions of that. Whereas if you draw it and show it to me, then we're instantly on the same page. So I think it's more like visual literacy is probably way more efficient, right?
Yeah, it's like, I want that flavor. I want to know what you're thinking. Is this going to be like cute and funny? Is this going to be really dramatic? And then once you start introducing even just like super weird, sketchy thumbnails with like the barest hint of detail and perspective, like that helps a lot. And I do think it's like, well, are we making a drama or are we making a comedy? Well, like if I pitch that to you with storyboards, you're going to get a lot more of the vibe that I'm thinking of than if I just handed you a packet of paper. I don't know. I've never written a script, so sorry. I'm not offending script writers. It's probably really, really important and good. I don't know what I'm talking about.
Well, I mean, I write scripts for all my books. So it is, for me, it's helpful, and it's helpful to do kind of shorthand of your visuals. Because for me, writing is faster than drawing. So it's more me telling myself the story back again, whereas my editor doesn't necessarily want to read my script. She wants to see the storyboards because that's closer to the finished result. So I think these things work hand in hand with animation, and it's more like certain people need certain things. And also it's just better to iterate an idea over and over again, because it's only going to whittle down to the best version of itself, because like, you know, something that was great one day could disappear in the next meeting because it's, you know, the honeymoon is over or whatever. Okay, so we've got this vision of this room and bulletin board full of cards, very old fashioned. And then apparently we hop into, again, this is like taken from an article and I'm kind of moving through it quickly. But they take all these scenes and they do start to build a script from this. And I guess things kind of start to part ways a little bit here. So you have like a script being written, and at the same time, you have a whittling down of these cards into storyboard elements. And I think the teams actually kind of start to break down at this point because you have different figures in the room who, like, some of them, their focus is cinematography, or some are more like invested in the acting, or, maybe some are editors. And they're all, deciding what they want to be pitching as like the crucial scenes of this movie. And I guess some of this idea is to, this idea of like pitching scenes, which is to basically say you're going to get up in front of a group of people and sell that group on the value of your scene, what it represents for the story, what the characters are doing, how they're moving, how they're inflecting when they speak, maybe even like sound effects that are happening. But it's basically like you're sitting, they describe it as like talking to a bunch of kids in story time at the library, which sounds like quite a pleasant experience. I would love to be an adult.
That sounds amazing.
Back at story time. But I think part of this is, you can write down ideas and you can draw them out as much as you want. But as we've, we'll get into a little more when we start talking more in depth in like early Disney, but there's so much evidence of the animators standing up and gesturing and like making faces to themselves in the mirror to try to capture the emotional, the seed of the emotion through expression or body language. So standing up in front of a group of people is a great way to make sense of your scene. And is there really a place for it in the story? And what does that look like? And I had this little idea, and part of the main reason I wanted to bring this up and connect it back to our Burrow episode. So go back and listen to that one. A little self-promotion there for a podcast you're already listening to. You're already invested.
So you love it. Yeah. You'll like this one.
So this pitching of scenes, even though I'm saying it sounds really pleasant to observe, it sounds extremely stressful to do because you're going to have all kinds of like feedback face to face when you're doing this. And the animated short Burrow is really about that feeling. So I'm wondering if Madeline Sharifian was thinking about the experience of making this film. When does Burrow come out, actually? Like, so I don't jump ahead. Did I say something that doesn't add up right?
It was paired with Soul.
Oh, yeah,
although
that's right.
I do believe that it had been completed earlier than that.
Yeah, in our Burrow episode, we kind of dug out of that movie that it was dealing with these themes of like creative collaboration through looking at actual interviews with the director. And reading this article about the production of Onward made me realize this pitching scenes moment is exactly the type of anxiety that gets evoked through Burrow as like the little rabbit attempts to find its place in its little community and validate its, engineering choices in his little room design and whatnot. So I just like when all this stuff comes together and we are slightly getting to know some of the figures behind the scenes here in Pixar.
It is funny though, because I'm just full of my little like anecdotes and quips in this episode. But back in the olden days with the Walt Disney situation where you had to get up, you had to meticulously pin every single thing to a cork board, and it would be like rows and rows of all of your drawings. And Walt Disney would just like sometimes completely lose it, or he would get up and rip your drawings off and like tear them up in front of you. So it sounds like in some situations it is very nerve-wracking. So I don't know how much that's going on in this day and age, but critique is tough.
Yeah, I mean, and some people would say it's essential. Like with animation and all types of filmmaking, I mean, these industries were both growing in tandem here. So they're both influencing each other in terms of production and in terms of like the types of stories they're aspiring to tell. And there's so many awful stories of film directors who are just so, focused on their vision that everybody's like personal well-being or emotions or feelings or just sense of self are falling by the wayside in pursuit of this idea, right? And it's always interesting to think like how passionate are some of these directors with some of these projects. Like if we go back to Toy Story, that movie doesn't feel like a visionary director so much as it feels like a magical collaboration of a big group of people learning something all together. And that's what makes that movie unique and special in the way a film shot on film like could never really be, because they're just not made in the same way. So that's like the one magical thing about, I think, animation that we're like figuring out a bit more here is that it's so collaborative.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's like a little stressful, honestly, when you think, I mean, all the film industry is huge. A lot of people work really hard to make movies, obviously. Mm-hmm. And we just know too much about how animated movies are made, but it's very cool. Like, it's very inspiring. It's cool that you can have it can go horribly wrong, I'm sure. It can be weird, probably, but I really like how collaborative it is. Like, I always loved the idea of a story department where everybody is working together. I mean, you have your own scene, and then your job is to sell that scene. But then we all kind of can decide, oh, this doesn't work ultimately in the story we're trying to tell or whatever. And you're just like, over the time, bits and pieces will make it into the movie. It's just kind of a neat, unique thing.
And now this, the story building process goes on to bring in scratch recordings of audio and whatnot. But I'm going to jump ship off that journey right here and focus in on, I think we got to talk about the Pixar cinematography very specifically, because just thinking about that aspect and their investment in the technology, like the resources they had, early on we talked about like Steve Jobs funding this whole thing from the early days, what they were able to pull off in this whole expectation of that Pixar feeling, to me, I think really does come down to the cinematography they're capable of doing. And I think they have great people working for them, but of course there are probably other great cinematographers out there, but they just don't have access to what Pixar has. And there's a specific person I thought we would talk about because she had a lot of interesting things to say about her experience with Pixar and specifically Onward. And that is the director of photography, Sharon Callahan. And she is a cool person, and she has been with Pixar since the beginning. This is, my first time really like thinking specifically about her, and I wouldn't even say I'd recognize her name in the credits. She's probably like, 6 or 7 title cards like deep in the credits. But listening to her talk about working on some of these films, like I just really came to appreciate her role in this. And Caitlin and I both watched a short documentary that we'll put the link in the show notes here so you can enjoy it as well. But she starts by telling her story and going through just the very beginning days of her time with Pixar, which is, Toy Story, like that first full-length feature. So Sharon Callahan points out that when they were making Toy Story, they started approaching that film. And I feel like they must have made it in order in a way, chronologically, scene to scene, in a way for her to say this. But the early scenes, they started by storyboarding in a very Disney type fashion, like Caitlin was just kind of pointing out this, like sweatbox approach, like throw the drawings up on the wall, talk about staging and framing and all these things, decide what works and pull down what doesn't. They did that for a good chunk of the movie, but by the time they started getting to the big climactic scenes that take place outside of the bedroom, it seems like they realized that taking a more cinematic film approach to planning this story was going to be the right route for them. And so not storyboarding, clearly giant part of it, but there's definitely this whole cinematography department that grew out of this need to understand the space and camera angles of cinema and film, and then implement them in their 3D modeling and animation, thinking specifically about like lenses and light. And if you watch Toy Story, thinking about that, it totally makes sense because the movie seems to grow and get bigger and more immersive, like in a way, in terms of like the world grows and you get more caught up in it and you get more interesting camera angles as the film goes on. So it totally makes sense for her to say that, yeah, we were truly like learning as we went through that film. And it's just like a dramatic jump in approach as they worked on that movie.
Well, yeah. And as we've talked about here and there before, advances in lighting have been some of the biggest contributors, I think, in making 3D movies look so incredibly real, like more and more over time. And I think it's what makes, if you go back and watch some of the earlier CG Disney movies, they do look aged in a way that the 2D movies don't really. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of it is the lighting. So if you go back and watch the first Toy Story, some of the textures you can look at, like the pebbly skin on T-Rex, and it's like pixelated and like your human eye can see it because we weren't working in like 4K or whatever back then. Like they didn't anticipate Blu-ray. So there's some of that. But like it's also just, yeah, the materials, but also the lighting. And we've mentioned before, in Monsters University, I think was the first Pixar movie where they had this global illumination. So it's just like, it's basically like the sun. Whereas up until that point, they really are manually just placing every single little light. And with global illumination, you can kind of have this like, here's a whole thing. We have like a super light, you know, and then you're going to need more light just like we humans on Earth do. But it adds a ton of realism and dimension to things. But it's kind of cool too, because Toy Story and Pixar came out of this massive love for classic cartoons that people like John Lasseter had. But it's funny because, yeah, you're doing it all in 3D. So you're using a camera. Like, it is a camera. If I'm sitting down and doing a 2D animated thing, or, you know, if I'm doodling like a little cell animated loop of something cute on my iPad, it's not, I don't have to worry about any of that stuff. It's all just like representational. So I'm looking right now. I have this giant poster on my wall of Woody and Buzz from Toy Story 2 that I got at a Pixar masterclass thousands of years ago. It's really cool. And it's Woody and Buzz like lovingly gazing at each other through the power of friendship. And they're just glowing, and you can see the plasticity of like Buzz's parts on him and his like glow in the dark parts, and the little textile elements on Woody's shirt and everything. But if you're drawing something, like if you're doing a cell animated movie, you can just represent the light to look right, if that makes sense. Like if I want, it's not happening in this particular image, but if Buzz had his visor up, like that bubble visor, it's plastic and you'll see reflections in it of other things in the room or like the sky. And again, like if I'm painting something, I can just choose to represent that with color and shape. But like in a CG environment, you need the light to behave in a realistic way so that that thing is happening. And it also looks weird now, increasingly weird to not have those things unless you're stylizing it in this very like art directed way. But so in Toy Story 1, a lot of things are very simply represented because that was the technology they had. They were pioneering this, or making a bunch of stuff up as it goes. And now they can do this crazy stuff with light. And so I was listening to this podcast interview with Sharon Callahan where she was talking about in the early days, if you wanted to have a light and then have that light be reflecting off of a surface somewhere else, for that second reflected light, you had to make another light to represent that. And then as the technology increased, you could actually just simulate that. So the original light is behaving as it would in the real world, which is like more render heavy, more intense, but a lot more realistic. And it's just, first of all, totally insane. Really cool. But it also, yeah, you can't approach this in this painterly way. It's just not, you're simulating. You're like creating a like physics of light. And then you need to know, how does light work? You know, how does the color of light behave on such and such objects and materials and all of this stuff that you wouldn't quote unquote need to know in the same way if you're doing a cell animated film. It is just like, let alone stuff like camera lenses.
Right. And this short doc I was watching, she was like the main the main interview on it, but they also brought in another DP, Adam Habib, who seems more invested and like responsible for choosing lenses and camera movements. And they had some footage that was just making me feel old because I was in such awe of what was going on. But he basically had this like Oculus Rift type helmet and like a camera rig in his hands. And, you know, he was acting as a camera operator would. But basically what he's doing is exploring like an environmental space. So if we're talking about the movie Onward, take a scene like the bedroom scene where they summon the father for the first time. Understanding how big that space needs to be to tell the part of the story it needs to tell, that's best decided if you could actually be in that space. So it's like such a backwards way of going back to like just basic set design and like camera placement, but through like total super high-tech 3D modeling. So they like build out these spaces, then the DP can go in them and decide what's working, what's not, where the camera's going, what needs to move around to present right in the shot and read clearly to the viewer. And that was just kind of blowing my mind because it's so many layers to basically just get back to that natural feeling of someone holding a camera, pointing it at something and like recording. So it's just interesting the way like tech always comes back to just, well, basically what we want to do is simulate like natural realism in a way, even if it's just like the shakiness of a camera.
Yeah, this is a very brief aside, and I should send this to you because it's really cool. But there's this video game apparently that's coming out soon called Harold Halibut, and I don't know anything about it except for the trailer. But if you watch the trailer, it's very clear that it's emulating the stop motion Wes Anderson style, like very specifically. But it was all done in Unity, so like a video game creation program with 3D capabilities. But it like is painful to the brain because it looks so real, and it's we have that already, right? Even like Leica in a lot of their movies uses CG to supplement their stop motion stuff, and like you can't tell the difference. So like we're getting there. But that was the first thing I've seen in a while where I was like, oh my God, like soon we're going to be at like, we'll have ultimate control. Like you've just made a whole actual world in there. And then you have perfect control over it because there are no external elements. It's just all in your box, in your computer box.
Yeah. And it's still, to me, even though it looks amazing, I think this movie looks great. It's probably, I don't know, it's a complicated feeling to break this down, but I feel like this movie looks great and I love the space it occupies. But like you just said, it is in a box. Like there's something very tiny about it. No matter how far they go out from their little suburban home, the sets all feel like miniature in a way. I don't know if it's part of the design choice. Like I feel it's very evocative of Disney World architectural and engineering design in the way that you have a 2-story building, but it's actually like 1 1/4 story, and they scale up the windows so they seem large, and maybe they angle the building in a certain way, or they lighten the colors as they move further away from you, so it seems like it's kind of caught in the atmosphere a little. This movie, the design of it feels like it's evoking some of that. It's like scaled down. I don't know if you know what I'm saying or if you get that feeling, but there's something very stylized like that.
Yeah, I'm puzzling over it a little bit because I agree with you. I hadn't really thought about it before. And there's an argument, I guess, to be made that it's very intentional because there's some themes here about the modern fantasy world. So AKA not really very fantastical, like not magical, is very constrained and small, I guess. And personally, I really don't get into this movie that much until we get into the third act where they're more like out in the wilderness on this quest. And I think that's a big part of why is they're like in these big like Lord of the Rings-esque like rolling hillscapes. And you don't see anything else of that before. You're just like weird small town vibes.
Oh, interesting. Because I wouldn't say I'm the opposite, but I really did love the kind of road trip through the grimy city, standing in front of an old vending machine feeling of a lot of this. Because I don't think I've ever seen that. I just haven't. I know I haven't seen it. I haven't seen that brought to animation, that like 80s road trip feeling vibe of just kind of old neon or just, you know, commercialism and marketing coming at you from every angle. Like they're always in like a gas station or like they're on a grimy, oily road and there's just like one street light working and they're like merging onto the highway. Just all the grime of the city in this movie, I just felt was really special and like lovingly done. And I think part of that is something that like Sharon Callahan was talking about with like the way they use color and light in this together, you know, basically for the goal of, you know, evoking emotion. That's the end goal of this. There was like a Pete Docter quote that she mentioned, which is probably something that's like painted on a wall somewhere, where you pose yourself the question, what information do we want to give the audience? And then how do we want them to feel about it? Which is like that extra Pixar question. It's like telling people how to feel in like, but extremely subtle ways, which could be simply, okay, when we show Barley, we use kind of a shaky cam because he has like this nervous energy. And then when we show Ian, it's like the camera's more steady and it makes you feel like more at ease and maybe even a little more rigid. And then when we, you know, light certain characters, there's like different approaches. And each little scene in this movie has like a color palette that's supposed to feel like a, you know, a bit of a D&D campaign where, like, for example, she mentioned how when they're in the scene where he's using the magic staff to try to scale up the gas tank because they're out of gas and they need gas. So Barley's like, oh, just blow up the gas tank and we'll have gas. The coloring in that is very green. So it's supposed to evoke, it's like the swamp level of their like a D&D campaign. And when you watch that, you're like, yeah, I guess I didn't really notice how green it is until she points it out. But you're feeling it when you're seeing it. You're feeling how distinct that scene is from like anything we've seen before or after. So I think it was just really interesting for me to watch this movie for like the third time and look at it just in terms of like light, focus, color, and framing. And it was revealing in very different ways.
Yeah, all I have to add to that is the lighting is really incredible in every way. And like the scene that jumps out to me, although I agree with you that the scene where they pull over and they go to the vending machine is so gorgeous. Like the vending machine is like bright red and it's reflected all over them. And like, that's very pleasing. It's exactly the way you're describing, but also like the van is open behind them and the dad is in there. And like the interior of the van is like woody and like orange and super warm. And then the night is all like sad and empty around them. And it's just, I don't know. It's very striking. But I also thought just, I guess purely on a technical level, but the highway scenes when Ian is driving and his brother is like, you have to merge, which is like a nice, that scene I enjoyed. I like that one. But the lighting of the car, all the car lights on this like heavily trafficked highway at night is a lot. It's like almost too much. And I don't actually mean that. It's not. It's really good. It's just like so impressive.
You know, I like reading books about filmmaking and her conversation about her whole thought process. And, you know, she was talking about doing Ratatouille and going to France and just doing like color studies of the light in the fall, like passing through the trees or like sitting down by a gutter and like finding out what particular gray those stones are. Just these like little intimate looks that when you go back and you sit in front of your computer back in California and you're in this like closed, controlled environment, like you need to remember what like the outside world looks like with these like little notes to yourself. And she just had a really nice way of kind of pointing out that you have to go out and you have to like know what the world looks and feels like if you're going to be able to come back and like expertly render these things with you know, like these tools that have been given you. That's always like a good reminder, because I feel like even though, you know, I do sit at a computer all day, even though I try to think that I don't, I am always looking at a monitor because I don't draw by hand anymore. And, you know, and you sit in front of After Effects all day. And I think it's very easy to like get lost in that world. And I feel like the Pixar people are always so good at like reminding you, like, you got to go outside because like that's where That's where like the inspiration comes from for these like emotional stories.
Onward takes place in a fictional realm of fantastical origin. Once upon a time, quite literally, it was awash in magical creatures, Pegasuses, centaurs, etc. Probably like ogres and wizards, and people did magic, and they had like wizards' apprentices and such. But much like our own world that we live in today, people were lazy and magic was hard, I guess. And so it was slowly but surely supplanted by the seduction of technology. So when we get into the meat of the story, we're in present day magical world where the characters are elves and unicorns are like the modern day equivalent of raccoons. And we have dragons as dog equivalent pets. But no one is casting spells anymore. Like, there are the trappings of magic in the world, but there is no magic left. So we are in a humble suburb with our two elf brothers that we spend most of the movie with, Ian and Barley Lightfoot. They live in New Mushroomton, which is very cute. The houses are all like big, thick mushrooms, which is really nice. And Ian, it's his 16th birthday. And Ian, being a youth of a certain caliber, is very anxious, I would say. Very shy, like seems to struggle socially. And his older brother Barley is like very loud, brash, kind of big older brother energy, where he's very like sunshiny and positive, but also seems like I don't know, kind of like a nerd, but also maybe a loner a little bit. Like he doesn't have that like like I'm like emo or whatever, but like, you know, you get the feeling that he's kind of like just like hanging with himself a lot of the time. And also like a minor side character is his van, Guinevere, that he claims to have built himself. And it's like very ramshackle. It has a big Pegasus spray painted on the side very tastefully. And that's his baby. So that is Barley, the older brother. So both of these boys' father, Wilden Lightfoot, passed away right after Ian, the younger brother, was born. So Ian never really met his dad, and even Barley, the older brother, only has a handful of memories of the father. So they live with their mom, and I don't think he lives there, but they're not a stepdad. And her boyfriend makes a few appearances, the centaur police officer, whose name is Colt Bronco. He seems like a sweet guy. So it's Ian's 16th birthday, and because this is such a momentous occasion, Laurel, the mom, gives him a gift that was predetermined for him by his father, who knew that he would pass before he would have a chance to get to know his youngest son. And so he left them this wizard staff and a rare magical item called a phoenix gem, along with a scrap of parchment with a visitation spell, quote unquote, that can bring back their dad for one full 24-hour period. Barley tries to cast the spell at first with like great pomp and circumstance, totally fails, can't get anything out of it. Ian tries to do it, and it turns out that he has the gift of magic, so he's able to execute this spell. But with a twist, they kind of screw it up, and only half the dad shows up. The bottom half, so not preferable. So it's all legs. And this is horrific. And so the boys, they decide that they're going to go on a quest to get another phoenix gem, which is this crucial element of the spell, that they have to have one. And it's like, these are incredibly rare objects. So they're going to go on a quest to find another one so they can complete this spell and hopefully get some of that day to spend with their dad. Because the clock is already ticking, since technically half of him is already here. So they're on the clock, they gotta go. And we do find out at this point that the phoenix gem and magic and spells like the visitation spell Barley has intimate knowledge of all of this stuff, not because he is like a secret wizard, like apparently their dad was, but his D&D equivalent game, which I think is called Quests of Yore, something to do with Yore. He knows that backward and forward. That's his favorite stuff. So he knows a lot about magic because that game is based on only true things. So all the spells are real. He can't perform them. He doesn't have the gift of magic, but he knows them really well. And he also knows, because he knows all of the quests that are in this game, that they need to go to the Manticore's Tavern in hopes to find the map that will take them to another Phoenix gem. So they travel to this tavern, and it is there, and there is a Manticore, but it is also a cheesy family restaurant, like a theme restaurant. And the Manticore, whose name is Corey, cute, is a harassed manager more than anything else. So they have a little bit of a confrontation with Corey because they really want help and they really want this quest to happen. They really want to spend time with their dad. And they reignite the passion of questing in Corey, who has justifiably, I would say, become concerned with mundane things such as like the legality of like being liable for people who get injured in these quests that she sends them on, and like paying her shareholders and stuff like that. But she's also dead inside, so their passion, gets her back on this train. But she doesn't actually tell them where to go next. They figure it out in a roundabout way by taking the kids menu that has this cute little game on it that's supposed to be filled out with crayons that are passed out by the hostess. And if you unravel that puzzle, it will tell you that you need to go to Raven's Point, which is a mountain nearby. So that's almost a map. They take this information and they go. Meanwhile, Corey the Manticore is having a meltdown, a revelation. So Ian and Barley, at this point, their quest really kicks off, gets underway, and they go through a series of quest-like events, episodes, if you will, various challenges and trials, as you would on a magical adventure. And all throughout these perils, Barley is teaching Ian different spells to help them navigate the various trials that they face. And on the flip side, known only to us as the audience, the mom has figured out what they're up to, and she is in pursuit, and she ends up meeting up with the Manticore because she traces their footsteps to the tavern. And we also find out simultaneously that Corey left out some critical information about what these boys might need to have to overcome a curse that will pop off if they manage to succeed to the end of their journey. So we have this element of urgency happening in the background. So Ian and Barley, they fight a gelatinous cube. They walk over an invisible bridge. They ride a giant Cheeto down a non-magical river, but still a river, through a cavern. And they pop up after all of these, these adventures, all of the bonding that they've been doing. They pop up right back where they started, which is in the street, like through a manhole, right across from their high school, which is disappointing. But it turns out that they were completely correct. This is exactly what they needed to be doing. And the Phoenix Gem is in the fountain in front of the school. But when Barley figures this out and he plucks the Phoenix Gem, curse. Oh, you forgot about that, didn't you? Here it is, coming to fruition. This curse emerges, and just like any curse, it rips apart the surrounding environs to create a giant dragon. And the dragon attacks them, and it can only be defeated by being stabbed in the core, which is this like magical glowing spot deep within its confines, because it's like a golem made out of stone and brick and all this stuff. And it has to be with this particular sword that, thank goodness, Corey and Laurel, fierce magical duo, have retrieved alongside Ian and Barley. Well, separately. They're not together, but simultaneously. And they manage to defeat this dragon. And at the last possible second, they manage to complete the spell. And they get, well, one of them gets a little bit of time, a little sliver of time with the dad right before that 24-hour period runs out. And that person is Barley, the older brother, as Ian has a revelation that, you know, it's very sad and it's hard that he didn't ever get to meet his dad. And he still didn't by the time the movie's over, but that his brother is actually a huge, huge presence in his life. And all the experiences he wanted to have with his dad, he's had with his brother. So he has something to celebrate at the end. And he feels good about their relationship. And they are happy. Magic doesn't return to the world, per se. But along the way, you know, people are a little bit happier. For example, Corey is still running a restaurant, but it's a lot cooler now. She is able to breathe fire freely. And yeah, so the world is just a little bit brighter for this quest that these two brothers have gone on. Roll credits. Carly Brandile. Brandile? What's her name?
Is that who sings the song?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was just getting
Brandile.
Sounds right to me, but I say everything wrong.
Brandy Carlisle. I am drunk. I was like, I can say it like 7 times before I get it. Brandy Carlisle, I believe, is the one who sings the end credits song, and it fades in gently.
I wish they would have committed a bit more to the sort of like dungeon crawly vibe of Barley. You get one moment where you get a real kind of light metal composition when they're driving Guinevere. I think the end credit song should have just been like just some loud guitar rock, like in the style of you know, like fantasy rock music, instead of this kind of like, I mean, I was fine with the song, but I was like, oh, this is an opportunity to go for it, but they didn't.
Yeah,
do it.
I have like mixed feelings where overall I think this movie's pretty good, and I enjoyed it more the second time, actually. But it feels like a little bit mixed in certain things, and I feel like, I don't know, that this is 100% just personal preference only and has no bearing on the quality of the movie in any way. But I realized as I was watching it, I like don't really like the like modern society plus fantasy mashup. And I guess like as a genre, it just doesn't work for me. So I just like wasn't really getting into it. And so all of that stuff kind of wasn't working for me. And even so the end credit song still has a little bit of like a throwback Americana vibe, not too distant from some of our previous episodes' music, such as Don McLean or America. Just someone in that same flavor. And I was just like, I don't know. I guess it works for me in those older movies, but not here quite as much. Although I think you're referring to the part where he sacrifices Guinevere the van to get the police off their tail. And he puts on this cassette tape that's like Ride to Valhalla. And it's like, yeah, playing this like 80s rock thing as the van like triumphantly soars to its death. And that part was pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think there's some scenes. I guess we're just going to have to be a little, our feelings are a little more contrasted with this one, because I'm kind of really not really into, I really like some of the realism they're bringing to some of the aesthetic, like, you know, back on the lighting conversation, when they go to the pawn shop and there's the weird like yellow-eyed goblin when they have to get the sword back. I love the look of that. It almost feels like it's blacklight-ish in there, like her eyes are so bright compared to like the darkness of the space. So I guess maybe I'm just appreciating the stepping up the contrast in terms of like lights and darks a bit, and just playing.
Oh, and she's the best character.
Yeah, she looks
she's
cool.
barely in this, but like she's so wonderful. The pawn shop lady, like, and her design is so great. She has this like slithery serpent's tongue that's just like very active. Mm-hmm. really nice. I want things in this movie to be a little more unhinged in that same way, I think.
Yeah, I think this could have been a really cool, like I was saying, kind of teen fantasy movie where you could take these little set pieces and go a little further. Because plot-wise and everything, it's playing it very safe, even though it has this really odd element that, to me, is the thing holding it back from coming together really well, which is the idea of the pants dad. So first of all, there's a couple of reasons I have a problem. You'll notice in the chat I put a link to a Dr. Seuss story. Are you familiar with The Pale Green Pants by Dr. Seuss? This story terrified me as a kid. It's basically like a Friday the 13th like slasher story, as this kid is like stalked through the dark by this pair of green pants.
I have vivid memories of reading this book and being like paralyzed with fear. Like just a kid sitting alone in my room, just flipping through this book, being like, like just being so terrified. It's so creepy. Yeah. And it's still creepy now.
Reasons it's creepy. If you're unfamiliar with this story, just the look of it, it's kind of this tealish green. So it's nighttime through the whole book. And the only spots of color are the yellow of the little bearish character and then the olive green of the pants. So let me just read like a quick little excerpt here so you get a taste for this story. When I was deep within the woods, when suddenly I spied them, I saw a pair of pale green pants with nobody inside them. Like, is that a story you want to hear? No, it's terrifying.
Except I don't know. I read it multiple times as a kid. But yeah, these pants want to kill you. They don't. I guess they're friends at the end, but like, holy shit.
So that's my relationship with like disembodied pants right off the bat. And I would guess that somebody at Pixar working on this film was like, oh yeah, that Dr. Seuss story. So do you argue for the pants dad or against it if you're familiar with the story? Because it's upsetting visually in general, but also I can see the compulsion to want to rise to the challenge of having a character be simply a pair of pants, colorful socks, and shoes, because they do some genius things with it in terms of like making it believable, making it relate to the boys. Like they have this little like tap on the shoe thing they do. The body language of the pants dad, I think, is pretty great. When he first is summoned, he's like checking the floor with his foot, and he like backs up and steps on a marker and like almost falls over. There's enough little subtleties where you can really feel the care and love that went into this idea, which will probably like never be seen again in the history of animation. Just a pair of like dad pants.
Well, until they make the feature-length adaptation of this Dr. Seuss story.
That's true. I will watch that in horror. So there's that. Now, the idea of the summoning of the pants dad and the visitation spell, like we've been talking a lot about fantasy and fantasy storytelling. Usually, the reviving of the dead spell is like a necromancer thing, and it's bad and it's evil, and it should not be done and never should be done. And if you do it, you're treading on upsetting territory. So to me, it's kind of the wrong approach, it's the wrong solution to telling a story about a kid who thinks he's missing his dad, but what he's actually missing is like coming to terms with like his brother being a role model. Like if that's the story you want to tell, I think the pants dad magic spell is very distracting from that story, because the idea is that the dad had the idea to, when he was very sick, create this spell so he could come back and see his kids because he was going to really miss them. But I feel like he shouldn't have wanted to do that, because if you know enough about magic, you know that, returning from the dead is just like a bad idea. Even Gandalf is like, that I'm only back to do this because it's the end of the world and I need to help you. But other than that, I wouldn't be like coming back. Like this dad just wants to hang out with his son again. So I don't know. We were talking a little earlier about why this movie doesn't all come together. And for me, that was like a big part of it.
Yeah, this is funny because I feel like now this is the conversation basically that we were sort of having on the drive home after watching this movie.
Yeah, I'm sure.
So it's like, this is like the most cartoon feelingsy episode, maybe, in a weird way.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, I had big problems with the pants dad thing, and I won't get into it deeply. But one of the reasons I came out of this movie kind of upset was because I know that the dad situation and the like two brothers who like really didn't get to know their dad is like from the director and like a real life experience. But like I didn't experience this, but my husband's like dad died pretty early on into our relationship, and it was terrible for so many reasons. And like just sitting here watching this and like watching, you know, younger people deal with that was like too much for me. And it also like made me angry sometimes in the way that it was handled. Like the idea of like having your dad there or like being able to bring your dad back for a day, like it just, I don't know. It's definitely not what I would have done. I don't think it works for multiple reasons. And it like raises these horrible questions.
Yeah.
It's like too many things. I don't know. I wouldn't have done it. And I also think having it being such a source of these slapstick moments just makes it like, it's not funny. You know what I mean? And it's not like, oh, this movie isn't funny and that's why. It's just like the idea of having your dead parent there with you almost is really horrifying to me by gut instinct, more than I'm like, well, this is like a fun road trip movie thing. I'm like, no, this is a huge deal. Like, that isn't funny. I would be crying the entire time if I was in this situation. I would not be like having a fun road trip with my brother. I would be having a full-on emotional breakdown. So I just don't like it. And then just like being aware of that, it's just kind of rough. And one of the things I remember saying after we watched it was, I think it would have all been so much more effective and like emotionally resonant without being distracting is if the dad wasn't there.
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily mind the resurrection for a day thing, although it would have been cooler if they'd couched it in like you can summon me from the astral plane or whatever, because that's like a D&D thing that is not you are coming back from the dead. And it sort of is that anyway, since it's only like a 24-hour period, like I'm coming back for a day. So why didn't you just have it be like, I'm going to open up a portal to like the plane of the dead or whatever, instead of, I don't know, muddling the messaging? That's fine. But I think it would have been better if he wasn't there the whole time. Like, have them mess up the spell at the beginning and he doesn't come, and then they go on this road trip.
Yeah.
And then maybe at the end it works and they have this like this moment, you know, and you can handle that when it comes. Or like, honestly, I also would have been fine if it didn't work, or if they didn't make it quite there in time. And so then you never know if the spell was even real or not, and that they'd gotten this adventure out of it. But having the dad be there and just being this like cutesy bit character, and then this kid also doesn't even get to meet him at the end, it was all just like too stressful for me.
Yeah, it has a very dark undercurrent through all the scenes, simply because it's all just, you know, an illusion. If you know anything about stories like this, you know that they're veering down the wrong path to want to bring the dad back. Like, there's not really a happy ending there. Like, maybe Barley shouldn't have even have seen him, because Barley didn't really seem to have anything to resolve with his father. It was more Ian's like interest and curiosity, I think, that pushes it forward, because they give him like the magic ability that connects him deeper with his dad. And he has the tape that he's listening to and having like this impossible conversation with the dad tape. So he's like more, I guess you could even say, not obsessed exactly, but like resilient to like move on. Whereas Barley has like other issues.
Well, it's interesting though, because I didn't pick up on this the first time, I guess, watching this, but I noticed it the second time when I was rewatching it. And Barley, when they're having their like Cheeto ride down the river, they're having this like quiet moment that's serious. And they're having this serious conversation between them as brothers. And Barley mentioned something like, I'd really love to have more than 4 memories of Dad. And at the beginning of the movie, he talks about having 3 memories of Dad. So Ian, of course, is like, wait, do you have another memory of Dad that you've never told me about? And then Barley tells this story that I actually feel like is like pretty affecting. And it was a moment where I was a little more sucked in that I had been up to that point. And he's talking about when the dad was sick, and he remembers that he was supposed to go in and say goodbye. And he was so freaked out by all of the hospital machines and all of the tubes and everything and the way that his dad looked that he couldn't do it and was like too afraid to do it. And so that is interesting to me in that they're specifically raising at that point the reason that Barley should be the one to talk to the dad, because he did have this unresolved moment.
Oh, okay.
Where
I forgot about that.
He failed to say goodbye to his dad as he was dying. And so this would be, I guess, his chance to fix that. And there's something there. I like that in a way. And that's sad for sure. But I still don't like it because we don't get to see any of it at the end. And it just doesn't, I don't know. I don't have a good solution. I just know that I wasn't satisfied with it in the moment. And when I realized that Ian wasn't going to get to talk to the dad, I just remember being like very disappointed.
Oh, really? I think it's just, more from a standing. I don't know how emotionally invested I was in all of this. Like, I have a complicated relationship with my dad where I think a lot about who he was more than knowing him. Like, I wouldn't say I've known him for the last 20 years. So everything that is emotional about him and like revealing is from my youth. So I do connect with the idea of like the like deep desire to like want more information and like understand maybe where you're coming, who you are, like by way of knowing your father better. So those things are there, which like maybe gives me a little bit more of a connection. And they're like, boys running around, which is always going to be like a default, like easy connection. But, there's a real commitment to Ian's point of view, whereas I think that's like seems to be a bit of a problem for you because you never really get a good look at Barley, and you definitely never see his point of view. The closest you get is like when he's urging Ian on to like do the spell on the gas tank. You get like close-ups of Barley, which are simply like to make you feel like he's encroaching on Ian's space. And so then when we get to the end and they have this elaborate setup to separate Ian from Barley and like place him behind this stone wall by way of like a giant like school dinosaur thing, I did think that was clever. And I don't know if that means it's good storytelling, but I was like, oh, I kind of like this setup in the way he's watching through this tiny window. And it might have just been more me responding to being in the theater and seeing like the point of view cropped down to like the little hole he was looking through. I just felt it just stuck in my mind, probably just because there was so much black on the screen, which is like kind of the same thing of like with Inside Out connecting with some of the abstract scenes because you're like blown away that they're doing this on the big screen. It's just not something you're used to seeing. So I think there's like a couple little clever moves they pull, but overall I think I'm kind of on board with you and feel that there's like a sad undercurrent. It's just funny
here because I was frustrated by that.
Oh, yeah.
Like having him literally be cut off from the whole point of the movie. And like, I get what they were going for at the end. Mm-hmm. And I was not really invested with Ian meeting the dad. But if you're going to tee that up as the whole point and then like physically block him from doing it. And I was just already annoyed by the dad thing. So it's like a lot of the stuff I like about this movie is adjacent to the dad thing, around the dad thing, and not about the main plot, which I just really didn't like for a few reasons. And that was like, yeah, I don't know. I honestly feel like they did a good job of bringing it home with the brothers' relationship and having them. There's this nice scene at the end where Ian is sitting with the dad legs and he's looking through this list that he'd made of like things I want to do with my dad. And he realizes that they've done them all together, like he and his brother. And that was really nice. That was genuinely really nice. And I think it would have, again, been a lot more resonant even if the dad wasn't there literally. and to have him be more of like it's weird for them to go on a quest to find their dad when the dad is half there, even though it obviously makes sense that he's half there, so he's not really there. But he is, though, and it's just like, I don't know. You don't go for the on a quest for like, we need to take this ring to Mordor, but we have half of Mordor with us. Like, we just need to go get the other. Like, it's like, that's just not how it works.
Yeah, my friend, he still does it. Well, actually, he's not really working on this project anymore, but he has this fantasy comic called Rutabaga, the Adventure Chef. And the story is Rutabaga, who travels through like different fantasy realms cooking. And at the beginning of the story, he has a giant backpack with all his cooking utensils, because just logically, your character needs to carry stuff, so give him a backpack. But pretty quickly, my friend is like, I resent giving him that backpack, because now he just has to figure out what to do with it constantly as like settings change. I feel like these dad pants are kind of like that. You can see once they play through the emotional gimmicks of meeting the dad by way of pants, like reconnecting with him and like having it be sentimental, then he is more just mostly a prop that's being carried around. And they try to give him a little bit to do. And there is sort of the cute, sweet dance scene, but a dance scene is always kind of charming. But then by the end, you're right, like he's really just being carried through like the end part of this story, but they're just stuck with him. So yeah,
poor little pants with nobody inside them.
Yeah. So that concludes my thoughts on the pants. So I think basically other things I have to say are really about, I think, the craft of the staging of these scenes, and the way they use the mechanics of the plot. I think they do a pretty good job of keeping you, I wouldn't say quite on the edge of your seat, because this is like a kid's movie. I'm not really like that invested and think anybody's actually going to get hurt. Like, this world is very safe for being like a fantasy world with all different types of creatures interacting. But I think they do a good job of having the characters constantly riding up to the line of failure, like with everything that they're doing. And I don't think I get that from all the Disney or Pixar like action adventure movies that we've been seeing lately, like Raya the Last Dragon, or like even maybe Zootopia. Like they're with these movies, there always seems, not specifically Raya, but Zootopia, because it's another contemporary setting, it seems to promise a little bit more danger or like groundedness, because the world looks kind of real. Like it has asphalt and street lamps, and people have like familiar social situations. So when you introduce these like crazy fantastical elements, we're always going to have like these questions come up that usually aren't resolved. Like, the questions of like, what's the dad thinking being pants? Like, we wouldn't have that question if this was like a Flight of Dragons style movie. We'd be like, all right, whatever. There's like floating pants man. This story's not that deep, so let's just not think hard about it.
It's normal for this world.
Yeah, like Pixar just kind of brings a level of realism that if they're doing something, like you kind of want answers for it. They promise more than some of these like lesser cartoons.
And we demand to have them.
Yeah, so we demand
contact us immediately. 1-800.
It's flashing on the screen. I think they can see it.
Dial now.
All right. So, I've some various questions about like what ideas the characters represent beyond just this idea of brotherhood. But I'm more curious to try to answer this question here. In English, I don't think we have a word for this, but there's a very specific feeling that I get, and I'm sure a lot of other people get it. Maybe you get this too. When a movie is very clearly evoking another movie, and it makes you feel not old exactly, it makes you feel you've seen it before, but it also makes you wonder if this is just simply like the circle of narrative, like we're always going to have beats like this happen over and over again. And I'm specifically referring to, I guess, the late second act of this movie is constantly doing like Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade stuff. Like they have the step of faith where Ian walks out onto nothing. That's exactly like a trial in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. They dive under like a giant stone door that's sliding down and pulls something through in the last second. Indiana Jones in his hat. Exactly that. There's a couple other like Spielbergian things. And I get this like feeling of exhaustion with just like, oh, is this all we're left with? We're just going to do like, you know, Indiana Jones adventure over and over again? Or are we going to like move past it at some point? There's got to be a word for that. I don't know what that feeling is. And I don't know how you feel about if you're getting that sensation. I don't know your relationship with like early 80s Indiana Jones, like action adventure stuff.
I mean, honestly, not extensively. Like, I've seen the Indiana Jones movies, and I don't have much of an association with them, really, and I don't know them super well. So I won't say I felt like a particular association, but I'm trying really hard to just only be constructive about this movie, which I think is like a 7 out of 10, probably. Gun to my head. If I had a Rotten Tomatoes,
sure.
This movie, it's good. It's not bad. But there were aspects of it that I just personally didn't like that have nothing to do with the quality of the movie. But there's some complaints that I have like that, where it does feel like, I guess I just wondered, why are we doing the 80s theme? It's actually starting to feel a little weird.
Yeah.
Because, and I think you can really pinpoint it in a lot of ways to the first season of Stranger Things, where it certainly wasn't the first, but it was like this pinnacle of 80s resurgence fever. And I liked it. And I love 80s stuff in general. Obviously, the 1982 was apparently the best year for
right.
many, many cartoon movies and similar. And I love all that stuff, and I love 80s music. But like, I'm getting a little fatigued of the pop culture obsession with the 80s now. Mm-hmm. And this one, I was just like, an 80s teen movie, huh? Okay. Maybe it'll be fine. But it really did feel like this is an 80s teen movie.
Yeah.
And then I was like, oh, all right. I want it to be something different. And, you know, I'm not saying you have to give that up entirely, because there are things that I like about it. And I even feel like if they'd really leaned into the D&D thing, it could have been something kind of special in a way that I don't think they landed with the D&D DNA of this.
Yeah.
But yeah, it just, this isn't exactly 80s either, but something I noticed about the humor of this movie in general, and this is probably the most cutting criticism I can offer of this movie, is the humor. I would describe it as when somebody trips off screen and then they go, "I'm okay," after. That joke that you've seen in 10 million movies, and it's like, really not funny. But there are a lot of jokes in this movie that have that setup and payoff, that it's just like, I know this one. And sometimes that's fine, but if it's like too constant, it's a little tiresome. And this movie just didn't have like the spark of originality, I think, that I'm like looking for. And that's not to cut it off at the knees, forgive the horrible pun. But I couldn't really just get lost in it. I just couldn't do it.
I think some of the limitations of the messaging are in the setting, like this sort of fake fantasy movie world that is perpetually the 80s, because it's where you get to have a cool van, you get to have like this puffy vest, you get funny sunglasses, you get just iconic aspects of like suburban, like mundane culture. It's just a really safe place to tell this type of story. And it is, yeah, you could call it 80s, but really I feel like at this point it's like a fantasy 80s that's just a way to frame like whatever type of like magical story you want to tell. And it hinders them from doing things like, okay, well, is this in any way a commentary on escapism or like the modern investment in fantasy story and our like disassociation with reality? Or is it about like the preservation of like historical artifacts like Barley is very into? Like all these things are just dead ends in terms of commentary, because this world looks real, But it might as well just be a Disneyland that they're roaming around in, because there's no backstory to what this place is other than the backstory of it used to be more magical. Just believe us because we told you in the setup at the beginning. Like there's no like socio-cultural context to any of this stuff. So therefore there are no stakes when like it comes up. They're just roadblocks to plot or like setups to be a gag or whatever.
Yeah, like I did feel that way about the Manticore Tavern when you go and it's this theme restaurant, and I was like, I don't totally hate this idea.
No,
and
it's
kind
cool.
of fun.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, like there are aesthetic things about it that I enjoy as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I also was like weirdly aware in the moment that they could just make this place in Disney World.
Yeah, totally.
And so I was like, okay, I mean, like I can't even criticize you for that. I would love for Disney Pixar to hire me to make scenes in their movies that they could also put in Disney World. That would be
right.
so cool. But it just feels cheap. And then honestly, maybe it's just because like these settings are boring and that not the movie, but like a theme restaurant, we're all like, ew, right? Like that's the point. That's a joke in the movie. It's like, ugh, like nobody wants to be here. And there's a weird mascot and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So then I'm not as like, maybe that's why it was harder for me to get into it. And I was realizing that like modern day fantasy is just a mashup of things that I don't like that much, because I like fantasy for fantasy, not so I can think about Applebee's. You know? Like
Yeah.
it's like escapism, but then also right back in your own suburb where you are right now. And I'm like, no, like, take me to New Zealand. I don't want to be here.
Right. Like it makes me wonder. So I don't know if maybe there's an answer to this, because I think sometimes I don't pick up on all the details. But at the end, when Barley figures out where the Phoenix gem is, he pulls it and he awakens a curse. And as far as I know, all we know is that there was a curse that he forgot he knew about. But what does it mean that there is a curse in that object? Like, does that mean anything, or is it just a way to set up this giant dragon?
Just magic.
Okay.
So that's why, like, it's a little weird if you're looking for layering of themes. This movie doesn't really have it, because it's kind of the same thing with the Manticore Tavern, where if you think about it, it gets a little weird because he knows. So you go to this Manticore Tavern to get the map to go on your quest, and he has this knowledge from like ancient times. So what, is this Manticore like thousands of years old and now she's reduced to doing this? Like, it's very strange when you think about it. And they're kind of telling this story in a I mean, that's how quests are. If you sit down to play a D&D game, it's usually like you're in a tavern and a wizard is there, and he is like, I'll pay you 100 gold pieces to get my Phoenix gem or whatever. And he just knows where it is. And if there's a curse, whatever. There's dungeons, there's traps in it. Like, that's just the game. But if you take it into like our real world, like why is all that stuff happening? Well, that's just how things used to be when life was a D&D game. It falls apart under scrutiny, really.
Yeah, it's like that fundamental problem of storytelling where like the reveal of information across the course of the trick that's being pulled on you. Like, what do you know when? What do characters know? When did they know it? When do you know that they know it? This movie is very muddled, like, in that way, which hinders, like, investment, I think. Like, the Manticore thing is exactly what I'm talking about. Like, all through that scene, you're just wondering, okay, she has all these tattoos, which we find out later, but, like, yeah, what does she remember? How old is she? Like, all these things, they need to kind of be known by the people putting together these storyboards and like story cards in these early meetings. And I find it quite baffling that you have all these people working on these projects for them to not care that much about that. And I think just because we've been talking about a lot of fantasy stuff, a lot of that 80s stuff is so much more endearing, even though it's cheaply made and maybe they didn't create the final product that's like extremely satisfying or even fully entertaining. But there's like a true commitment to some of that early creative process of coming up with meaning and reason for using these tropes. Like you can, as simple as like the dragon in this movie is simply just like a third act Avengers style fight. It's not because there's any love for the idea of a dragon, which is something like in all these other movies we've talked to up to here. There's like something magical about the fact that we have a dragon in this movie or a unicorn or whatever. There's just a belief that symbolically represents something. This dragon is just designed to like look unique and cool and be a fun thing to fight, bring the mom into the battle a little bit, like check off all these boxes. And the only thing it's not doing is evoking the idea and magic of a dragon. So it's like a hollow idea. And how is nobody...
Literally.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, is that the point? Probably not. And also, it's made out of the school. Why? Simply because it was like a clever play off the idea that they could have the mascot on the side of the building so it can come full circle. There's a lot of like...
Let me just say.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is kind of funny.
It's cute, yeah.
Like, there's a part where, so like, there's a dragon mascot painted on the wall of the high school, and the head of that dragon, which is like cute, cartoony dragon, becomes the face of the monster. And there's a time during the fight that its eyebrows on that like wall like pop out and like angle down to be angry eyes. And that is funny, and I like it a lot. I just want to celebrate that moment and be enthusiastic about that.
Yeah.
But I agree with everything else you're saying.
But I mean, that is the dividing line why it is so challenging for us to talk about this stuff, because one, we come to this stuff because we want to see the dragon with the funny eyebrow moment. That's like essential to like what makes these movies special and good. But then on the other hand, we are people that want like stories that are interesting and compelling and resonate. And also we've seen a lot of, so you're going to have to work hard to surprise us on that level. And a lot of the time these stories are totally unfulfilling on that side. So it's such an unbalanced, experience with some of these new movies, especially the ones that look so good like this. You're like, how can you look so amazing, but really have nothing interesting to say?
Yeah, it feels like, where do I begin? The way that this movie is structured is very like quest format, as I mentioned earlier, where each trial that they attempt on this quest is very distinct, to where you could easily just like slot one out, put a new one in there, and like from scene to scene, nobody would really notice. The only forward momentum is ostensibly they are moving physically closer to their destination with each one. So you could lose that like, I need to cast an invisible bridge spell over this canyon to get to the other side. You could just take that whole thing out and put something else there. Like whatever you wanted. It could be like they find themselves in like a lava cave underground and they have to like, navigate, whatever. You could put anything. And that's good in a way. I mean, that gives you a lot of freedom to play with things. But then it becomes kind of obvious that they aren't building in a linear fashion to some thematic thing. And the closest thing I can think of is when they're driving on the highway and Ian is driving and he's freaking out. And then his brother is like, you'll never be ready. Like, you have to merge, which gets me every time. I do actually really like, because the fear when you're learning how to drive, like, that's real. That's how it goes the first time you merge onto the highway. It's a very realistic moment. And then, that's one of the things that he's like, I wish my dad could teach me how to drive. And then he realized that his brother has like fulfilled that role for him. That's pretty cool. But that's not even like a trial, really. But like, there's nothing thematically resonant that I can think of about this invisible bridge that like crosses the canyon. And I can think maybe they're trying to go for, well, Ian is very unconfident.
Yeah.
And so the only way that this spell works is that he has to believe that it will work. So the minute that he wavers in his confidence, he will fall. Mm-hmm. But they don't play that up enough to the point that I don't really think about it while it's happening. And I also, like, maybe I'm just not convinced by Ian being this unconfident. I mean, he's definitely an unconfident person in the way that he acts. I just, like, am not very drawn into that for whatever reason. And then, I don't know, I think I would have liked it if the brother had, like, pumped him up a little bit more deliberately while he was doing that. It just doesn't feel like when I'm watching it, it feels like just like a fun thing that's happening and kind of scary because he could fall. It doesn't feel like, oh, this is like they're bonding, you know, like they're invested, like I'm the brothers' relationships. Like it doesn't have the impact on me that I want it to have.
Yeah, no, I agree. I don't care much about Ian. He is either very guarded or there's just no development to who he is because he, you know, I think I'll say this basically anytime I talk about a character, but if they look like they just walked on the screen for the first time and you don't get a sense of like anything existing before that moment, like right away, I think that's just like a real bad start. And Ian doesn't really seem to have much of a backstory. The tape scene is almost, it's not even enough because it's more just explaining something about him to you. But it's like he really has never talked to those kids before. He's like that awkward. Like I understand trying to invite people over. Like we all still have those problems. That's like a charming little moment of insecurity and like weakness that endears you to him. But he goes to school with these kids. Like he has zero friends. He has like the, you know, what are his interests? Like his brother has a backstory. It's like that. It's like the Harry Potter problem, basically. It's like all Harry's friends are a million times more interesting than him. And not to always.
It's exactly who I thought of.
Yeah. I mean,
Harry Potter.
It's just the most iconic one. I feel like we always bring him up because I know some people listen to the show probably like care a lot about Harry Potter, and you and I both do to some degree. It's like, it's part of our existence.
Yeah, like I grew up with Harry Potter. I can't.
But it is the worst type of protagonist, right? It's like, it's just a vessel for the plot and like for more interesting characters to bounce off of. And their development is usually like satisfying because it resolves the story, not because like we really cared about their journey.
Yeah.
Harry's a little different because he has 7 books and that's like, it's written, you get a lot of interior stuff. But with Ian, yeah, I'm on board with you. It's like there's not much there.
What's funny? I'm casting about for comparison because that's just how this is going. But for some reason, like Finding Nemo pops into my head as like a movie with like a nervous, unconfident main character in the dad, Marlin. And even he's like kind of unlikable. Just personality wise, but you don't sit there being like, man, I just don't care about Marlin because he's kind of 3-dimensional, pun. Not just because he's a CG fish, but because he is, there's a reason that he's so nervous about everything. You are exposed directly to kind of his emotional trauma. So you're sort of like there on that journey with him. You know exactly why he's the way that he is. And there's also like so much attention or enough attention kind of given to his relationship with his son, I think, that it all sort of like fleshes out his motivations. You feel sympathetic even when you're like, you need to chill. Like you're being really obnoxious or whatever. Like be nicer to Dory. Like get your shit together. And in this, it's like Ian's just a boy. He's just a boy. There's nothing more. And yes, like he's a boy who doesn't have his dad anymore. But the only reason I should care about that is because we all know that it's sad to not have a dad. And then when the dad is there, it's just like, oh, he's pants. Like, isn't that funny? And like in my head, I was like, this is traumatic. Like it should be traumatic. And like, if my dad came back and he was dead and came back as half pants, I would throw up. Like I would be an emotional wreck. Like the slapstick thing, why? I don't know. So then it's like, he doesn't feel like a real person. Like he's not reacting to anything in a way that is real to me. And like, yeah, everybody's been awkward and like socially weird and like been nervous to invite people over. But even the friends are kind of like that. It's like this group of friends that he clearly goes to school with. And he's like going to invite them all over. And they're just like staring at him with these sort of like neutral smiles. And like, you kind of get the feeling that no matter what he would have said, they would have been like, yes, great. Like they have nothing more to offer than that. And it's just it doesn't feel real.
Yeah, there's a lot of, I would say, aside from the Manticore, which is hinting at like a more compelling character, even the mom is really just an accessory to the journey. Even they try to give her some like action moments at the end, but I feel like they don't really add up to anything. Like they're just recalling that she was like working to an exercise video at the beginning, and then they play the song, so it's like a gag payoff. But she really doesn't have an existence outside of just specifically supporting the boys, because like her husband is there. Like, out of all the people having an emotional connection, and I mean, that's a whole can of words to open, just like her just disinterest in it all, as if it's something that like happens, like, oh, well, sometimes boys awaken half their father and, they have to go on their little journey, and mom's just gotta support that. And when they're, let them do their thing. It feels like it's that, because she just like stares blank-eyed at it at the end.
That feels like very 80s to me, and like the total dismissal of the mom character who's just there. But I also don't think that's a good excuse. And I remember talking to you about this too, where, because I guess I'm just naturally going to be like, okay, well, if I was the mom, I would be losing it, because I would also be kind of pissed that the love of my life or whatever was like, yeah, I'm going to come back for one day, but I really just want to hang out with the kids. And like, I get that too. I do, especially because like the point of that really is like, I won't get to meet my son. And that's like, I want to do that. So that's why I'm doing this. Mm-hmm. But like, I think I would be absolutely devastated. And like, I don't care if I have a new centaur boyfriend, like that's going to be emotional. And if Neil died, please don't. He's not in here, but I hope he doesn't. I really hope he doesn't.
Me too.
But if he did, and then I got a new centaur boyfriend, and then he came back for a day, I would want to see him, and it would be a big deal. Yeah. Like, I can't imagine just being like casually like, well, good luck. Oh, I guess I better follow you because I heard it's dangerous or whatever. Like, what? Like, just give her a little bit of emotion. I would have loved a little scene where she's clearly worked up about it, or like let her meet the dad. Make a movie about the mom.
Yeah. I mean, you know what I think, like, to kind of round out this frustration, I wanted to bring up the early conversations that the creative team is having about these projects, because I think it does come down to probably political choices of like, well, the point of view of this movie is Ian. So therefore, I bet somebody had a note card that was like, mom's story. There probably was a row of that, because I just feel like why wouldn't it have happened? Like I would have written it. Most people probably would have. Like, you're also, wanting to know. There was probably that curiosity, but.
And she's like Julia Louis-Dreyfus. Like, I'm sure at some point they had some more stuff there.
Yeah.
Like,
but I think it with stuff like this, it comes down to like, is it following the point of view? No. Shut it down, because we're going forward, like we're running out of time. And that is like good storytelling advice to some degree, but also like, it becomes a problem when you're not being like flexible with that. Like, it makes some moments stronger to have the point of view exclusively Ian's through the whole film, but also it really limits like some other things to be like so committed to that. But maybe that's like the nature of this type of like kid-friendly animation, is you can't shift gears too much like that in terms of point of view, because it creates too much gray area, and it loses that like just simple appeal for the kid.
I think what it comes down to is this is a thought I had earlier, and it's just been crystallizing in here, because we were talking about this story kind of being a little unsatisfying in various ways. And I was hearkening back to our recent episodes about fantasy, and how like a lot of the movies that we talked about are kind of weird, and yet we still mine a lot of enjoyment out of them. If that's like The Last Unicorn, Cartoon Hobbit, like really you could point to any of those movies and be like, weird story, like weird choices, weird stuff happening in here. And I'm going to like home in on The Hobbit as an example, like the animated Hobbit movie that we talked about recently, which, as we discussed in our episode, ends in this very abrupt, strange way where it's like, by the way, the 5 armies are here. And then anyway, he's going home and stay tuned for part 2 of the story. And it's like kind of weird. But that movie, I genuinely think is really good. And there was a reason I think that we liked it so much, like when we were kids, and then still enjoy it when we watch it as adults. And it's because the Hobbit, Bilbo, is really good. Like, he's just a good character with appeal. And so you can forgive a lot, or the minutia of the story doesn't have to carry so much weight, because I really just like seeing him think about stuff and solve problems that he has to be presented with. I like his personality. He just feels like real. Like, he feels like a real character. And then this movie, as we were just kind of saying, is like Ian doesn't really. And so all of the other stuff stands out just a little bit more, for better or for worse. In this case, I guess for worse. But like, because I'm not really invested emotionally in Ian's story, then I'm like kind of casting around a little bit, being like, okay, so like, what's the thing? Like, what's the thing that like I'm gonna really just like, whoosh, like I'm sucked into this now. And then it just doesn't really happen for whatever reason. And that's not even to say that it won't happen for other people. But I think that's like kind of the main problem from our point of view, is just feeling like Ian is not interesting enough to be like, yes, like I want to hang out with Ian. I don't really.
Yeah, I mean, he's basically a gelatinous cube of a character, I feel like.
I would love it if we could get a high-dollar, big-budge film about a gelatinous cube. I think they're underrepresented in cinema, frankly. There's been a couple good ones, but yeah, for the most part, there's not enough cube-related content.
Yeah, let's get out the note cards and start writing this.
Onward to the end of the episode. Ira, tell us what's next on our quest.
Is that your Riddle Cat voice?
I think my Riddle Cat voice was just like a distinctive part of my personality that I am also using now.
Okay.
I don't know what it is. It's buried in there. It's my theatrical voice.
All right, everyone, you can check out more of Caitlin's voices in our episode archive and all kinds of other content about cartoons. And I'm in there too as well. All this stuff is over at cartoonfeelings.com. You can tweet at us or join us on Instagram, and both of those can be found at Feeling Cartoons.
True. And if you have thoughts or questions, you can write them to us at cartoonfeelingspodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear if there's anything that you'd like to hear from us. And if you are enjoying the podcast, it would be super cool if you would consider taking the time to rate us and review us on Apple Podcasts. And above all, just share us with any of your friends that you think might like what you're hearing.
That's all for now, folks. See you next time.